Iraq's president has rejected the nominee for prime minister. He says he'd rather quit than name someone rejected by protesters who are demanding an independent candidate. So, what's the way forward for Iraq? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. For months now, Iraqis have been voicing their anger and demanding a change in their political leadership. They say they're fed up with corruption, unemployment, and the lack of basic services. Hundreds of people have been killed. The Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi resigned in November, and now many are rejecting the nominee to replace him. They say Asaad Al Eidani will only help Iran extend its influence in Iraq. And President Barham Salih says he will resign rather than appoint Al Eidani. But the main political bloc that picked Al Eidani is refusing to back down. We'll bring in our panel in just a moment, but first, this update from Dorsa Jabari in Baghdad.
A political maneuver with potentially far-reaching consequences. Iraq's president has sent his resignation letter to parliament, saying he would rather step down than approve a new prime minister. In a 3-page statement, Barham Salih said, "Out of my keenness to avoid bloodshed and protect civil peace, I will not name Asaad Al Eidani as a candidate for the next prime minister." Eidani is the governor of Basra province. He was nominated for the role by the largest bloc in parliament, Al-Bana. That coalition is made up of mainly Iranian-backed political groups, which is why their candidate is being fiercely rejected by their opponents. Eidani was picked to replace Adel Abdul Mahdi, who resigned in November after months of anti-government protests. But the governor has been accused of neglecting his own province. Basra is home to more than 70% of Iraq's oil reserves, but locals don't have the basic necessities like clean water and reliable electricity.
I don't think they will accept his resignation. I think they will try to convince him is that you must accept our candidate in a way or another. But I don't think he will accept that. He will try hard also to push over in, just I said, someone who is independent, transparent, didn't be inside the political process and look for the future of Iraq.
Protesters have strongly rejected Eidani's nomination, and that's the reason President Saleh gave for not approving the choice. It now means, since Mahdi's resignation, no party has proposed a candidate who has been acceptable to all sides. The protests, which began here in early October, have been about demanding political change in Iraq. A new electoral law was finally passed on Tuesday, which seemed to please most Iraqis. And now this latest move by President Saleh to reject Eidani's candidacy is likely to strengthen the demonstrators' position. Dorsa Jabari, Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
Let's bring in our guest. Joining us here in Doha is Zeidon Alkinani. He's an independent researcher on identity politics in Iraq and the Middle East. In Baghdad, Ali Nashmi, a professor of international relations at Mustansiriya University. And joining us via Skype from Hertfordshire in the UK is Salah Hashimi. He's a legal advisor to the National Council for Iraqi Opposition. Welcome to each of you to Inside Story. Ali Nashmi, over in Baghdad, what is your reaction to President Barham Salih's position?
No, I think it's not resign. He sent a threat. I think this is a politic movement. He wants to relieve. He wants to push out or put out all this pushing from another wings in the political process now. Now he said, if you go on to force me to nominate a candidate of biggest bloc, I will resign. He said he didn't say I am resign. He said I will. This is many agendas and many wings and many directions now surround the Iraqi scene. And I think Mr. Salih, I think used that condition because he want to be strong, because he want to jump on the Constitution. Constitution say for the president, he must follow that condition. Say he must accept who nominated from the biggest bloc, but he refused that. Al Eidani. This is
right.
out of the constitution. They will use that, but I think there is another conditions or the directions forcing him, the streets, the protesters, and al-Sadr followers, and American agenda.
Okay,
and,
we're going to talk about all of this. We're going to talk about all of this. Salah al-Hashimi in Hertfordshire, just give me your initial reaction to this position that the president has taken, and constitutionally, what does Parliament do next with this threat of a resignation?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and please allow me to offer my sincere condolences to all those who lost their lives and were injured during these protests. Now, in terms of the president's resignation, I think, or the threat of resignation, I think your guest in Baghdad was correct. It's a mere threat to resign. There are a number of reasons for that. I think he is unclear at this moment in time as to who is the largest bloc, although he did receive a letter from the head of the parliament nominating Al Bina bloc as being the largest bloc. But let us not forget that one of the elements that constitute Al Bina bloc is the Sadrist movement, and that Sadrist movement has essentially withdrawn its support from the Al Bina bloc, with particular focus on the nomination of the prime minister, and has said that I would like to allow the demonstrators to nominate somebody. And therefore, I think constitutionally, whether the Al Bina bloc remains to be the largest bloc is questionable. The other issue is, I think, that's not being focused on is the fact that the Kurdish bloc, the Kurdish parties, have expressed their absolute and utter rejection of the new electoral law. Immediately after the passing of that law, we had a press conference by that bloc, by the Kurdish bloc, and they have said clearly and unequivocally that they rejected for certain deficiencies that they did not make clear. Certainly, the electoral law did not meet the demands of all of the demands of the demonstrators either. Most importantly, that it relied on a majority vote rather than the 50+1 that was demanded by the demonstrators.
Right.
So I think the president was also motivated to put his resignation in solidarity with the Kurdish bloc that rejected the electoral law.
Okay, Zeidon, do you agree with that he did so in solidarity? And also, if the president wanted to resign, wouldn't he have actually resigned? I mean, in this letter, he's just threatened to resign. So what's behind that move?
Well, we have to not forget that Barham Salih is a veteran of the ethnic sectarian quota in Iraq. He is the figurehead of the Kurdish piece of cake of the ethnic sectarian quota in Iraq, which the protesters are protesting and revolting against. The ethnic sectarian quota and the political class in Iraq today are going around in circles. The circles are whether it be in the constitution, the parliament, or the presidency, or giving figureheads or candidates who are veterans of the ethnic sectarian quota, such as Al Eidani, who was the governor of Basra and who is very known for being one of the very pro-Iran politicians in post-2003 Iraq. So the ethnic sectarian quota class in Iraq today is trying to find so many different ways. They're trying to buy time from the protesters for them to forget, for the protesters to be put in a situation, in a reality situation, where they have to accept one of the candidates from the very same political class. The protesters have been very clear. They want to rewrite the constitution. They want to dissolve the parliament, which consists of this very same political parties that have been ruling Iraq since 2003, a US invasion-installed regime and constitution and parliament that has failed to provide the public services, the right education, the social services, and the right healthcare system to the people of Iraq, to the new democratic Iraq, as
we're going to talk about the demands of the protesters a little later on, but let me just focus on what's happening sort of in the parliament and constitutionally. And Salah, back to you, because you were mentioning the Bina bloc just a moment ago, which of course nominated Al Eidani. They've responded to the threat of the president's resignation, saying this, that Barham, quote, admitted he was violating the constitution, which gives us the right to hold him accountable in parliament and dismiss him. Is that a route that the bloc is going to go down?
They might do, but I think they are going down a road that is against the demonstrators' wishes, because we are now scaling things in proportion to what's happening on the streets. We are not only dealing with what's happening within Parliament, and that's exactly what Al Bina is doing. Because I think you have your reporters correctly said that they are motivated somewhat by a somewhat Iranian influence. Now we are looking at if the Al Bina bloc insists on nominating Al Eidani, whose history is not in any sense encouraging. Let's look at the Basra province itself, and let's look at his own history in being the deputy director of an Islamic bank that was sanctioned by the US for helping the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, apparently. That's what I've read. And therefore, his nomination is not exactly, not only just not suitable, but it also can be construed as somewhat humiliating to the people, to the demonstrators on the streets. Yes, they can take legal action against the president, but however, I think the president is going to turn back and say, I have made my decision in order to withhold so much violence that's going to ensue on the streets of Iraq because of that nomination. And I think I have made the right decision. So I think he does have a valid defense.
And Ali Nashmi in Baghdad, to what extent is this being used as some sort of pressure card on the blocs to come up with an alternative name?
No, I think they will continue, and they try to force him from the parliament and to relieve him from his presidency. But I think everything will go on because Mr. President, he will not insist for his resign because and because I know him personally, he is not ready to relieve or to leave that position. And this is, I think, the Kurdish also they are not ready to nominate another person because it's very difficult now to nominate another person. I think it's very difficult to insist from, but I think this is political movement, and also the other side, his enemies or his protest him or somebody he want to push him. I think they will weaken their pushing against him. I think next week many negotiations will happen between Mr. President and the other wings. But I think in the end of the scene, there is many nominee, there is many candidates, but I think in the end, the nominee who is beside or who the nominee from the American agenda, because there is many names. But I think there is because Mr. President, he insists now to find another one out of this politicians. I think he will insist or the chief of the Iraqi intelligence, Mr. Mustafa Al-Kadhimi, he is very near for the American side, and he's have many relationship with the American side. And American side, they will use that situation to put his ally in the Iraqi, to put him in the prime minister, because the situation is very weak. And also the biggest list or biggest bloc, it's not have the strength to fight to put their nominate, and I think the parliament now is very weak, and also the state.
Stand by for a second, Zeidon. Do you agree with what my guest from Baghdad is saying? I mean, is this going to be resolved within parliament itself, or often we see in Iraq that issues are not resolved within parliament, but rather they are left to various factions and leaders and also external powers? My guest from Iraq is talking about the U.S. influence.
Most definitely. Iraq is a playground of influences and external factors, whether it be the U.S. or Iran and other neighboring countries. And this is one of the main reasons why the protest movement was born in Iraq in early October 2019. The protesters are demanding the downfall of a regime which was installed by the constitution through the support of the external factors, as our colleague mentioned, whether it be the US or Iran. Al-Bina is the pro-Iran bloc in the Iraqi parliament. They are their largest bloc because of the negotiations, the post-elections negotiations that happened and formed that majority bloc. It is not because the people voted for them to become the majority. And this is one of the main reasons why people are realizing there are so many flaws in the system in itself, which is why people are willing to change the system throughout their own plans, throughout their own agendas, and not the agendas of the US or Iran. What's happening in Iraq today is an exact, perfect reflection of Iraq's reality. Iraq's reality is that Barham Salih has to face the agents of Iran in the Iraqi parliament. Adel Abdul Mahdi is just the figurehead of that ethnic sectarian quota. The people did not protest against Barham Salih or Adel Abdul Mahdi personally. They're protesting against the entire system, which includes the parliament itself, which includes to rewrite the constitution that is covering up for the ethnic sectarian quota, that is covering up for the political parties that are not focusing on how to rebuild a destroyed country from the invasion, but focusing on how to push the agendas and the interests, whether they be economically or politically, of those external factors, as we just mentioned.
Are there any names, Zeidon, that could be put forward that would be accepted by the protesters? Because let me just put this to you. We know that sources close to the Shia cleric Muqtada Sadr, of course, posted this on Facebook. 3 names. Mustafa Al-Qadimi, he's the current head of the Iraqi National Intelligence Service. There's a retired judge, Rahim Al-Aqili, and Faik Sheikh Ali, who's sort of seen as an independent liberal politician. He's also a member of the Iraqi parliament. Would you know if any of the protesters would be accepting of these people?
The protesters have been very clear with especially the names that you just mentioned. There is a diversity of opinions in between them. Faqih Sheikh Ali is the so-called representative of the secularist front in the Iraqi parliament since 2014. He is not accepted by the majority of the protesters, not because of his secularist views, because most of the protesters themselves are calling for a secular state in Iraq, but because he's still a part of the ethnic sectarian quota in Iraq. And that shows and reflects that the people, the protesters in Iraq, are not against the religious aspect only of the Iraqi state, but also against having anyone who were a part of the ethnic sectarian quota in Iraq, whether they be secular or religious. Mustafa Al-Kadhimi, as you mentioned, has a background of being a veteran of the ethnic sectarian quota in Iraq and the Iraqi state, so that is clearly not even in discussion for the protesters. The protesters are focusing and putting their main focus on having the dissolving of the regime, rewriting the constitution, new elections for a temporary transition, a temporary government that would lead Iraq to a transitionary period, and then they would focus on having candidates to be put forward. They're even being very careful on proposing spokespeople for the revolutionary protest movement, because they're worried that a lot of the conflicting, differing opinions between the protesters might occur during the very early stages of the revolution.
Right, which brings me to my next question. And Salah, Hashimi, as Zeidon was saying, the protesters seem to know what they want, yet, the opposition or the protesters are sometimes being accused of being poorly organized, divided, as well as leaderless. Has that worked against them?
Somewhat, but there is an underlying reason for that. We have Iraq is awash with armed militias. We have seen their actions, their devastating actions, recently near the Senek Bridge, where approximately 50 protesters were murdered and a number of them were kidnapped. So you are asking unarmed protesters to protect themselves against armed militias, and we have on the other side the army and the security forces on whom the protesters would rely to protect have had their arms withdrawn, and they are completely powerless to stop these militias from attacking the demonstrators. I think I think the policy of relying on the so-called, and that's by government's own admission, the third party whom that they have not named and they have accused of committing crime against the demonstrators, have backfired on them, because now the demonstrators are absolutely not I would say frightened, but they are somewhat concerned of naming anybody or going forward with any nomination, simply because of the fear that they might be targeted for retribute, and that they may not exist even after a while. We have seen many kidnappings and killings on the streets of Iraq, especially after the demonstrations have begun. And therefore, there are reasons for the lack of nomination. There are reasons for the lack of leadership. It is because the government's own policies have backfired on them. The government has tried and time again to appear before the international community as being civilized, as not harming the protesters. And when harm was done and when murders were committed, they pointed the finger at this third party. And that's where we are at the moment. We have a ghost, we have an unnamed faction that is committing murders and kidnappings. And now we are asking the protesters to come out with force and nominate certain faces and nominate spokesmen on their behalf. This is going to be extremely difficult in the current circumstances.
Ali Nashmi, on the issue of the protesters and what they're calling for sort of the removal of the entire political class that has plagued Iraq for the past number of years and decades. In fact, give us the point of view from the ground. Is that easy to dismantle in Iraq?
No, I think the protester now, the protester now is composing from many wings and many sides. We cannot say the protester, they have one agenda and one voice. There is many agenda. All the agendas surround Iraq, they interfere by internet. Baathists and the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Turkish, and even the Iran. And
but we're just simply now we're talking about the genuine demands of the protesters on the ground.
Now they refuse everything coming from the politicians, because they want to relieve all the system, because they going on the street against all the system, against all the politicians, because they are corrupted in their mind, then want to relieve it. But on the ground, who moving the protester now is the followers of Al-Sadr. They are the main. In the beginning now, Al-Sadr, he didn't interfere in the protesting now. But after that, now we can say what the followers of the Sadr need. I think they will interfere. I think that will be the voice or the name of the protester. Now, this is the problem. This is what I can say. If the Sadr refuse any name, the protester, they refuse it because they arrange it. They arrange it because they are logical. There is many thousand between the protester and they ruling that the street and ruling the protester that everything you see it in the street is coming from the follower of Assad. That very important. Maybe somebody will refuse my speech now. No, but this is the truth. Now I think next week we'll make many negotiations between the wings of the Iraqi situation politics, and they will result because I think Mr. President he will reject. He will refuse his resign. He will not resign because he's not ready to leave that, and the Kurdish also. And I think there is compromise will happen next week between the parliaments and the wings to make a new one, and maybe the Sadrs accept him, and the biggest bloc will accept him, and maybe America will not refuse him.
Zeidon, speaking of the biggest bloc, now the constitution in Iraq gives the biggest parliamentary bloc the right to name a prime minister, but seeing as the legislature itself is divided on who constitute the biggest bloc, how can this actually be resolved? What happens next?
This can only be resolved to rewrite the constitution, but I would only like to point a fact that was mentioned by our colleague. Yeah. The corrupted minds of those protesters, as he calls them, those are the corrupted minds who created a civil society and gave birth to a civil society in Iraq that was never witnessed in post-2003 Iraq. They were faced by militias that are the armed wings of the political parties of the corrupt parliament in Iraq today, killed unarmed protesters just because they spoke up against the corruption and the state violence against their own people since post-2003 Iraq and since the October Revolution. Muqtada al-Sadr is not the leader or the spiritual leader of the revolution. He was put in that position gradually thanks to the corrupt ethnic sectarian quota which put him in that position because they know very well that the protesters are against having Muqtada al-Sadr or any veteran or leader from ethnic sectarian quota Iraq to lead them today. Those so-called corrupted protesters on the streets, they're the least corrupt people in post-2003 Iraq. In fact, they are the most integral thing that has ever been witnessed. So what happens next is that the protest movement is only getting stronger and stronger. The more people you kill, the more resilient and resistant they will become, and they will witness the resignation of the entire political class, and they will witness the resignation of the entire parliament, and they will rewrite the constitution. If it doesn't happen in 2019, it will happen in 2020. If no outcomes, no real outcomes on the ground would happen today, this is the beginning of a new Iraq, of a new conscious and aware youth that stood up against an ethnic sectarian quota that pushed for the external factors, as both our colleagues mentioned today in today's Iraq.
Salah, Hashimi, final word to you. How do you see all of this playing out?
Well, I agree with your guest in Doha in that the protests are moving from strength to strength. And I think if the political elite are going to continue to turn their backs on the wishes of the protesters, I think we might be witnessing the turn of a protest to a revolution. And I certainly hope that this revolution will continue to be peaceful, because I think, come what may, I will also agree with your guest in Doha in that we do need either an amendment, an overhaul, an amendment of the constitution and the entire laws that were enacted after 2003, because they have simply proven not to be suitable for modern day Iraq. They have been prone to corruption, and they have been used and mishandled by the corrupt political elite. And therefore, we do need an overhaul. And I think it's time for the political elite to listen to the street, because the consequences might be irrevocable. And that we are heading towards at the moment, I'm afraid.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us, Zeidon Alkinani, Ali Nashmi, and Salah Hashimi. Thank you very much. And thanks for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter Our handle is AJ Inside Story. For myself and the whole team here in Doha, bye-bye for now.